I was sipping my morning coffee when I saw Deborah from the HOA marching up my driveway with that clipboard. She always carried like a weapon, and I knew my peaceful Thursday morning in suburban Ohio was about to get complicated. "Nathan Jenkins," she called out before she even reached my porch, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who believed they had authority over everything within a 3-mile radius. "We need to discuss a serious violation." I set down my coffee and stepped outside, already feeling my jaw tighten. Deborah Patterson had been the president of our Willow Creek HOA in Columbus, Ohio for the past 5 years, and in that time, she'd made it her personal mission to make everyone's life miserable. She was in her mid-50s, always wore pantsuits that looked uncomfortably stiff, and had that haircut that every HOA president seemed to get at some point, the one that said, "I'd like to speak to the manager," without having to say a word. "What violation would that be, Deborah?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She flipped through papers on her clipboard with dramatic flair. "Your crawlspace. According to our records and a recent inspection by board member Patricia, your crawlspace isn't being properly maintained. It's below the required temperature threshold for winter months." I blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" "The HOA standards clearly state that all areas of the home must maintain a minimum temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit during winter months to prevent pipe damage and maintain property values." She tapped her pen against the clipboard. "Your crawlspace is currently at 48 degrees. "How would you even know that?" I asked, feeling anger starting to bubble up. "Did you break into my house? We have our ways of monitoring compliance," she said dismissively. "The point is, you're in violation. You need to install heating in your crawlspace immediately, or you'll face fines starting at $500 per week." I rubbed my temples. "Deborah, that doesn't make any sense. Crawlspaces aren't typically heated." "That's why they're called crawlspaces and not living spaces. The rules are the rules, Nathan. You have 2 weeks to comply." She turned on her heel and started walking back to her car. "Wait," I called out. "I need to see this rule in writing." She pulled a stapled packet from her clipboard and thrust it toward me. "Section 12, subsection 4. Read it yourself, and don't think about ignoring this. The board takes these violations very seriously." After she left, I sat down and actually read through the document. Sure enough, there it was, buried in pages of HOA nonsense. A rule that had apparently been passed 6 months ago at a meeting I hadn't attended because I'd been visiting my sister in Michigan. The wording was vague and probably unenforceable, but it was there. The thing was, they had no idea what they were asking me to do. When I bought this house 3 years ago, the previous owner, an older gentleman named Robert, had walked me through everything. The crawlspace wasn't just a crawlspace. It housed the main water line that served not just my house, but 6 other homes on our street. It was an old system from when the neighborhood was first built in the 1970s, before modern subdivision standards. The main line came into my property first, then branched out underground to the other houses. Robert had been very clear about one thing: keep that crawlspace cool and dry. The water main was old but functional, and temperature fluctuations could cause problems with the aging infrastructure. He'd shown me the maintenance logs going back 20 years. Everything in that crawlspace was carefully balanced, but explaining that to Deborah would be like talking to a brick wall. I'd dealt with her enough times to know she didn't care about logic or reason. She cared about control. I called my neighbor Marcus, whose house was one of the 6 that shared the water main. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Marcus, it's Nathan. We might have a problem." "What's up, man?" I explained the situation. There was a long silence on the other end. "They want you to heat the crawlspace." "Are they insane? That could mess with the water pressure, maybe even cause expansion issues with those old pipes. That's what I'm thinking. But you know how the HOA is. Deborah doesn't care about practical concerns. What are you going to do? I'm going to try to fight it. But I wanted to give you a heads up. If they push this and something goes wrong, it could affect your water too. Keep me posted. Let me know if I need to come to any HOA meetings or something. Over the next few days, I did my research. I pulled the original property surveys, the water system documentation, and even called the city's water department to get their input. The clerk I spoke with, a friendly woman named Susan, was shocked when I explained what the HOA wanted. "That's a really bad idea," she said. "Those old systems are temperamental. If the water main is currently functioning well, you don't want to mess with the environment it's in. Heat could cause the metal to expand, and with pipes that old, you're risking cracks or even bursts." "Can you put that in writing?" I asked. "I can send you an email with our department's general guidelines, but for something this specific, you might want to hire a licensed plumber to do an assessment." I thanked her and hung up. Then I called 3 different plumbing companies. The first 2 were booked solid for weeks, but the third, a local outfit called Riverside Plumbing, said they could send someone out the next day. The plumber who showed up was a guy in his 40s named Dave. He had the kind of weathered look that comes from years of actual hands-on work, and he listened carefully as I explained the situation. "Let me take a look," he said. We went down into the crawlspace together. It was tight, cold, and dark, lit only by our flashlights. Dave spent almost an hour down there examining the water main, checking connections, looking at the valve systems. When we climbed back out, he was shaking his head. "Your HOA is asking you to do something really stupid," he said bluntly. "That main line is old, probably original to the neighborhood. It's copper, and it's been stable for decades because the temperature down there stays consistent. You start heating it, you're going to cause expansion and contraction cycles that these pipes weren't designed for. What could happen? Best case, nothing immediately, but accelerated deterioration that'll cause problems in a few years. Worst case, the pipes crack or burst within months and you flood your crawlspace and potentially cut off water to 6 other houses. Can you document this?" "Absolutely. I'll write up a detailed report. But I'm going to tell you right now, if your HOA forces you to do this and something goes wrong, the liability is going to be a nightmare. You're talking about potentially tens of thousands of dollars in damage, plus the cost of replacing the entire water main system for multiple houses." He sent me the report 2 days later. It was thorough, technical, and absolutely clear in its recommendation: do not heat the crawlspace. Armed with this information, I requested a formal hearing with the HOA board. According to the bylaws, they had to grant it. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at Deborah's house, which also served as the unofficial HOA headquarters. I showed up with a folder full of documents: the plumber's report, the water department's guidelines, the original property survey, and documentation about the shared water main. I also brought Marcus along as a witness and affected party. Deborah's living room had been set up like a courtroom, with her and 4 other board members sitting behind a long table. Besides Deborah, there was Patricia, a woman in her 60s who always seemed angry about something; Kenneth, a retired accountant who mostly just nodded along with whatever Deborah said; Sandra, who actually seemed reasonable but rarely spoke up; and Gary, a newcomer to the board who I didn't know well. "This hearing is to address the violation at 2847 Maple Drive," Deborah began formally. "Mr. Jenkins, you were notified of your violation 2 weeks ago. Our records show you have not yet taken steps to comply." That's because complying would be dangerous and potentially illegal, I said, opening my folder. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Illegal? That's quite an accusation. Let me explain. I pulled out the property survey first. When this house was built in 1974, the water main was run through my property to service not just my house, but 6 others. This is documented in the original subdivision plans and my property deed. The main water line runs directly through my crawlspace. I saw Sandra lean forward with interest, but Deborah's expression didn't change. I hired a licensed plumber to assess the situation. I slid Dave's report across the table. His professional opinion is that heating the crawlspace could cause serious damage to the water infrastructure and potentially cut off water service to multiple houses. Kenneth picked up the report and started reading. His eyebrows rose slightly. I also contacted the Columbus Water Department. I provided the email from Susan. They confirmed that altering the temperature of an environment containing old water mains is not recommended. This is all very interesting, Deborah said, her voice dripping with condescension, but it doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of HOA regulations. Deborah, did you even read the plumber's report? Marcus interjected. If Nathan heats that crawlspace and the pipes burst, my house loses water. So do 5 other families. That's a hypothetical, Patricia said dismissively. What's not hypothetical is that Mr. Jenkins is in violation of community standards. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. Let me be very clear. If you force me to heat that crawlspace and something goes wrong with the water main, the HOA will be liable. We're talking about potential damage in the tens of thousands of dollars, not to mention the legal liability of cutting off water service to multiple households. Are you threatening us? Deborah asked, her voice sharp. I'm stating facts. I'm also stating that I will not comply with this order because doing so would be negligent and potentially dangerous. Then you'll face fines, Deborah said, starting immediately. $500 per week until you comply. Sandra finally spoke up. Deborah, maybe we should consult our own expert before we proceed. If there really is a risk, the rules are clear, Sandra, Deborah interrupted. We can't just ignore violations because someone brings in some convenient paperwork. Convenient paperwork, I said, my voice rising. This is a licensed plumber's professional assessment and official communication from the city water department. This hearing is over, Deborah declared. You have 1 more week to comply before the fines begin. If you refuse to pay the fines, we'll place a lien on your property. I stood up, gathering my documents. You're making a serious mistake. The only mistake was giving you any extra time at all, Patricia added. Marcus and I left. In the driveway, he put a hand on my shoulder. That was insane, man. They didn't even consider what you were saying. I know. I need to figure out my next move. Have you thought about getting a lawyer? I had, actually. But lawyers were expensive, and I wasn't sure I could afford a prolonged legal battle with the HOA. Still, it might come to that. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA. The fine had already been assessed, despite Deborah saying I had 1 more week. $500 due immediately. I stared at my computer screen in disbelief. They hadn't even waited the time period they'd stated. I called Marcus again. They already sent the fine. What? They said you had a week. Apparently that changed. I spent the morning researching HOA law in Ohio. It turned out that while HOAs had broad authority, they weren't unlimited. They couldn't force homeowners to do things that violated building codes or created safety hazards. The problem was proving that this qualified. I decided to call the city's building department. I spoke with an inspector named Tom who listened to my story with growing concern. So they want you to install heating in a crawlspace that contains a major water main, he asked. Yes. That's not a standard practice. In fact, it could potentially violate building codes depending on how it's done. If you're altering the environment around critical infrastructure without proper permits and engineering studies, that's a problem. Could you put that in writing or come inspect the situation? I can do better than that. I can make it clear to your HOA that any modification to that crawlspace would require city permits and approval, and that we'd need engineering studies first. That should slow them down. That would be incredibly helpful. Tom said he'd send an official letter to the HOA within a few days. I thanked him and hung up, feeling like I finally had some ammunition. But Deborah wasn't waiting. 3 days later, I received another email. A second $500 fine, plus a notice that they were beginning the process to place a lien on my property. I'd now been fined $1,000 for refusing to do something that multiple experts had told me was dangerous. That's when I decided I needed a lawyer. I found a real estate attorney named Jennifer Cohen who had experience with HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Columbus, and she agreed to meet with me that same afternoon. Jennifer was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and no nonsense. I laid out everything for her. The demand to heat the crawlspace, the shared water main, the expert opinions I'd gathered, the sham hearing, and the rapidly accumulating fines. She listened carefully, taking notes. "You have all the documentation?" she asked when I finished. I showed her everything. The plumber's report, the water department email, Tom's letter to the HOA, the property survey showing the water main configuration, and the HOA's violation notices and fine assessments. Jennifer read through it all, her expression growing more serious. "This is actually a really strong case," she said finally. "The HOA is clearly overstepping. They're demanding you make modifications that could damage critical infrastructure serving multiple properties. That goes beyond reasonable community standards. Can we stop them?" "We can do more than that. We can sue them for harassment and potentially seek damages. But first, let me send them a cease and desist letter. Sometimes that's enough to make these petty tyrants back down." I authorized her to proceed. She drafted a detailed letter explaining all the reasons why the HOA's demand was unreasonable, potentially illegal, and definitely dangerous. She sent it via certified mail to ensure there was proof of receipt. For a few days, there was silence. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the HOA would see reason. Then I came home from work one evening to find a notice on my door. Not from the HOA this time, but from a heating company. Apparently, the HOA had authorized them to install heating in my crawlspace, and they'd be arriving the following Monday to begin work. I immediately called the heating company. "This is Nathan Jenkins. You left a notice on my door about installing heating in my crawlspace." "Yes, sir." "We have a work order from your homeowners association. I need to make this very clear. You do not have my permission to access my property or my crawlspace. If you show up, you'll be trespassing and I'll call the police." There was a pause. "Sir, we have authorization from the HOA. I don't care what the HOA told you. It's my property and you don't have permission. If you attempt to proceed, you'll be named in a lawsuit. I'm represented by Jennifer Cohen at Cohen & Associates. I suggest you contact them before you do anything else." I could hear the uncertainty in the person's voice now. "Let me talk to my supervisor and get back to you." I immediately called Jennifer and told her what happened. "They're trying to force the issue," she said, anger evident in her voice. "This is getting ridiculous." "I'll call the heating company and make it clear that they'd be assuming massive liability if they proceed. I'll also file for a restraining order against the HOA tomorrow morning." A restraining order to prevent them from accessing your property or authorizing anyone else to do so. At this point, they're engaging in harassment and potentially criminal trespass. I hadn't thought it would escalate this far, but here we were. Monday morning, I took the day off work to make sure I was home. Sure enough, at 9 in the morning, a van from Summit Heating and Air pulled up to my house. I stepped outside immediately. 2 workers got out. I approached them before they could even grab their tools. "Gentlemen, I'm Nathan Jenkins, the homeowner. You need to leave. You don't have permission to be here." "We have a work order from the HOA," one of them said, holding up a clipboard. "And I told your office last week that you don't have my permission. This is my property, and if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." They looked at each other uncertainly. Then Deborah's car pulled up behind their van. Of course, she got out, wearing another one of her signature pantsuits. "Mr. Jenkins, these workers are here under HOA authority. You need to let them do their job." "Deborah, this is my private property. The HOA has no authority to send workers onto my property without my consent. You're in violation of HOA regulations. We have the authority to remedy violations." "No, you don't. Not like this. And my attorney has already filed for a restraining order against the HOA. You should have received notice this morning." Her face flushed red. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. You're the one who escalated this. Multiple experts have told you that heating the crawlspace is dangerous. You've ignored all of them. You've levied fines without proper procedure. And now you're trying to trespass on my property." One of the workers held up his hands. "Look, we don't want to be in the middle of this. If the homeowner doesn't want us here, we're not doing the work." "You're under contract with the HOA," Deborah snapped at him. "Lady, we're not getting in the middle of a legal dispute. Come on, Bill." The 2 workers got back in their van and drove away. Deborah turned back to me, practically vibrating with anger. "You're going to regret this, Nathan. The fines are going to keep adding up. We will put a lien on your property, and eventually we'll force a sale to cover the debt." "You can try," I said. "And my attorney will make sure you personally are held liable for harassment and abuse of authority." She got back in her car and peeled out, leaving rubber marks on my driveway. I went inside and called Jennifer to update her. She sounded satisfied. "Good. The restraining order should be processed today. That'll legally prevent them from accessing your property. In the meantime, I'm going to file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, abuse of authority, and seeking declaratory relief that you're not required to comply with their heating demand." "What are the chances we win, given the evidence you've compiled?" "Very good. The hard part will be dealing with the HOA's insurance company. They'll want to settle to avoid the publicity and potential damages." The restraining order was granted that afternoon. A temporary order preventing the HOA from accessing my property, authorizing work on my property, or levying additional fines pending a full hearing in 2 weeks. I thought that would be the end of the immediate crisis. I was wrong. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a loud bang from somewhere outside. I grabbed my phone and looked out the window. There were no cars on the street, nothing obviously wrong, but something had woken me up. I pulled on clothes and went outside with a flashlight. Everything looked normal. Then I heard water running. My heart sank. I followed the sound around to the side of my house where the crawlspace access was. The door was open and I could hear water gushing. I shined my flashlight inside and saw a nightmare. Water was spraying from somewhere deep in the crawlspace, and it was already several inches deep. The water main had burst. I immediately called 911, then called the city's emergency water line. Within 15 minutes, I had a police officer, a fire truck, and a city water crew at my house. The city crew shut off the main water line from the street, cutting off the leak. But the damage was done. My crawlspace was flooded, and more importantly, 6 other houses were now without water. Marcus came running over in his pajamas. What happened? The water main burst, I said, my mind racing. But it doesn't make sense. It was fine, unless... I looked around at the crawlspace access door. It had been padlocked. I'd installed that lock myself. The lock was now on the ground, cut clean through with bolt cutters. I pointed it out to the police officer, a young guy named Officer Reynolds. Someone broke into my crawlspace tonight. He examined the lock with his flashlight. You're right. This was definitely cut. Any idea who would do that? And then it clicked. The bang that woke me up. Someone hadn't just broken in. They'd sabotaged something. I need to call my attorney, I said. Right now. I called Jennifer despite it being 2 in the morning. To her credit, she answered. Someone sabotaged the water main in my crawlspace, I told her. The access was locked and the lock was cut. The main burst about an hour ago. Don't say another word to anyone except the police, and only give them the basic facts. I'm on my way. The city water crew worked until dawn, assessing the damage. The water main hadn't just burst naturally. Someone had damaged it, possibly hitting it with something heavy. The evidence was clear in the dent marks on the copper pipe. Jennifer arrived around 6 in the morning, looking remarkably put together for someone who'd been woken up in the middle of the night. She spoke with Officer Reynolds for a long time, showing him all the documentation of the dispute with the HOA. By 8 in the morning, 3 detectives had arrived. This wasn't just property damage anymore. This was criminal mischief affecting the water supply of multiple households, and the damage was going to run into tens of thousands of dollars. Detective Sarah Morrison took my statement. I laid out the entire timeline, the HOA's demands, the escalation, the restraining order, and now this. Do you have any direct evidence that someone from the HOA did this? She asked. No, but they're the only ones with motive. They've been demanding I heat the crawlspace despite multiple experts saying it's dangerous. Last night, someone broke in and damaged the water main. We'll investigate, she said. In the meantime, do you have security cameras? I didn't, but Marcus did. He'd installed a Ring doorbell system 6 months ago. The detective went to talk to him. An hour later, she came back with a very interested expression. Your neighbor's camera picked up something. Around 1:30 this morning, a silver Honda Accord drove slowly past both your houses with its lights off. We got a partial plate. We're running it now. The investigation moved quickly after that. It turned out that the silver Honda belonged to Patricia, the HOA board member. When detectives went to her house, they found bolt cutters in her garage with fresh metal shavings that matched the lock from my crawlspace. Patricia initially denied everything, but when faced with the evidence, she broke down. She claimed Deborah had convinced her that I was going to ruin the neighborhood property values, that I was being unreasonable, and that they just needed to create a situation that would prove heating the crawlspace was necessary. She admitted to cutting the lock and going into the crawlspace, but claimed she'd only intended to take pictures to show that it was too cold and damp. She said she'd accidentally hit the water main with a heavy flashlight she was carrying and panicked when it started leaking. Instead of reporting it immediately, she'd run, except the evidence didn't support that story. The pipe had been hit multiple times and with significant force. The city's water engineer said it would have taken sustained effort to damage the pipe that badly. Patricia was arrested and charged with criminal mischief, criminal trespass, and reckless endangerment. The reckless endangerment charge came from the fact that her actions had cut off water to multiple households, which could have had serious health and safety implications. But the detectives weren't done. They obtained a warrant for Deborah's phone and email records. What they found was damning. Deborah had sent several text messages to Patricia in the days leading up to the incident. While they were carefully worded, the intent was clear. Messages like, "Something needs to happen to show Nathan the consequences of his stubbornness," and "If there was a problem with the water main, it would prove we were right all along." The prosecutor decided there was enough evidence to charge Deborah with conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and solicitation of a crime. She was arrested 3 days after Patricia. The damage to my crawlspace and the water main was estimated at $47,000. The city had to bring in specialized contractors to replace the entire main line serving all 7 houses. During construction, we had to use temporary water lines that ran above ground. The HOA's insurance initially tried to deny the claim, arguing that Patricia and Deborah had acted outside the scope of their authority. But Jennifer argued successfully that they'd been acting in their capacity as HOA officers, pursuing HOA business, and therefore the organization was liable. The insurance company settled for the full amount of damages, plus an additional $30,000 to cover my legal fees and compensate me for the harassment I'd endured. They also required the HOA to drop all fines and violations against me and to revise their regulations about crawlspace heating. But the real satisfaction came from what happened to Deborah and Patricia. Patricia took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to criminal trespass and criminal mischief, receiving 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and had to pay restitution to the city for the emergency response costs. Deborah fought the charges. Her trial was in March, about 4 months after the incident. Jennifer encouraged me to attend, and I did. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the text messages, they had Patricia's testimony as part of her plea agreement, and they had the entire documented history of the HOA's harassment campaign against me. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Andrea Walsh, painted a picture of an HOA president who'd become so drunk on her small amount of power that she'd convinced herself she was above the law. Deborah's attorney tried to argue that she'd never explicitly told Patricia to damage the water main, that Patricia had acted on her own. But the jury didn't buy it. After only 3 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty on both counts. The judge was not lenient. At sentencing, he said something I'll never forget. HOA boards are supposed to serve their communities, not tyrannize them. You abused your position, harassed a homeowner for trying to protect critical infrastructure, and then conspired to commit a crime when he refused to be bullied. You're going to serve as an example that this behavior will not be tolerated. Deborah was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation. She was also banned from ever serving on an HOA board again. The HOA itself underwent a complete reorganization. Sandra, the one board member who'd seemed reasonable, resigned immediately after the arrests. Kenneth and Gary were voted out at an emergency election. Marcus actually joined the new board to help ensure nothing like this ever happened again. The new board's first action was to repeal the ridiculous crawlspace heating regulation. Their second was to establish a new policy requiring that any major regulation changes be reviewed by licensed professionals in relevant fields before being enforced. Their third was to issue me a formal apology. The whole ordeal took almost a year to fully resolve. The water main replacement took 3 months. The legal proceedings stretched on through the summer. But by the time fall rolled around again, life had finally returned to normal. I was sitting on my porch one October evening, drinking coffee and watching the leaves change colors when Marcus came over. "Hey, man. Board meeting tonight. Wanna come?" I'd been avoiding HOA meetings since the whole incident, but I figured it was time to re-engage with the community. Sure, why not? The meeting was completely different from what I'd experienced under Deborah's reign. It was civil, organized, and actually focused on real community issues like road repairs and park maintenance. When someone raised a concern about overgrown hedges on someone's property, the board agreed to send a polite letter and offer to help connect the homeowner with affordable landscaping services. No threats, no fines, just neighbors helping neighbors. After the meeting, several people came up to thank me for standing up to the old board. One older woman named Helen said, "We were all afraid of Deborah. Nobody wanted to be her next target. What you did freed all of us." I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. Deborah had ruled through fear and intimidation. By refusing to back down, even when it got difficult and expensive, I'd broken that cycle. As winter approached, I made sure to keep monitoring the temperature and conditions in my crawlspace. Not because any HOA regulation required it, but because that's what responsible homeowners do with critical infrastructure. The new water main was functioning perfectly, and the city had actually upgraded some of the connection points while they were doing the replacement, which meant better water pressure for all 7 houses on the line. I never saw Deborah again after the sentencing. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved away after she got out of jail, went to live with family in another state. Patricia stayed in the area but kept a very low profile. I'd occasionally see her at the grocery store, and she'd always quickly turn and walk the other way. I didn't blame her anymore. I'd been angry at first, furious that someone would be so reckless and destructive. But over time, I came to see her as someone who'd gotten caught up in Deborah's toxic influence and made terrible decisions as a result. She'd paid a steep price for it, and I hoped she'd learned from the experience. The following spring, I installed security cameras around my property. Not because I expected another incident, but because the whole experience had taught me the value of documentation and evidence. You never know when you might need proof of what really happened. I also became much more active in the HOA, not as a board member but as an engaged homeowner. I attended meetings regularly, reviewed proposed regulations before they were voted on, and made sure my voice was heard. Marcus and I actually formed a small group of homeowners who committed to keeping the HOA accountable and transparent. We created a neighborhood newsletter to keep everyone informed about HOA activities. We established clear channels for people to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. We made sure that expertise was valued and that decisions were based on facts rather than personal whims or power trips. It's funny how a crisis can sometimes lead to positive change. Our neighborhood is better now than it was before the whole Crawlspace incident. People are more engaged, more willing to speak up, and more committed to looking out for each other. The HOA actually functions the way it's supposed to, serving the community rather than ruling over it. One evening about a year and a half after everything had happened, I was working in my yard when a young couple walked by pushing a stroller. They stopped to introduce themselves. They just bought Patricia's old house. "We heard there was some drama with the HOA a while back," the husband said. "But everyone we've talked to says it's a great neighborhood now." "It is," I said. "Just took some work to get there." "Well, we're excited to be here," the wife said, bouncing the baby gently. "Everyone's been so welcoming." After they left, I thought about what she'd said. Everyone had been welcoming because they felt safe now. They weren't living in fear of arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement. They could just be neighbors. That's what a community is supposed to be. I finished my yard work and went inside to start dinner. Through the window, I could see families out walking, kids playing in yards, people chatting on front porches. Normal, peaceful suburban life. My crawlspace was still just a crawlspace. Cool, dry, unheated, exactly as it should be. And the water main inside it continued doing its job, quietly and efficiently, serving 7 families without any fanfare or attention. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones where you just leave well enough alone. The legal settlement money went partly to repairs and legal fees, but I had enough left over to finally take that trip to Alaska I'd been planning for years. I spent 2 weeks hiking, fishing, and enjoying the wilderness. It was therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. After months of stress, conflict, and legal battles, I needed to remember that there was a bigger world out there beyond HOA regulations and neighborhood disputes. When I got back, I felt refreshed and ready to fully move on. I'd won. The community had been improved, and the people responsible had faced consequences. It was time to let go of the anger and frustration I'd been carrying. Marcus and I started a tradition of hosting a neighborhood barbecue every summer. The first one was in my backyard, and over 40 people showed up. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, kids ran around playing, and for a few hours, we were just a community enjoying each other's company. At one point, Marcus raised his beer and proposed a toast. To Nathan, who taught us all that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Everyone cheered, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. These were my neighbors, my community, and we'd been through something difficult together and came out stronger. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, Helen, the older woman from the HOA meeting, came over to me. "You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 32 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of changes, good and bad, but what happened with you and the HOA, that was a turning point. You reminded us that we have power too, that we don't have to accept unreasonable authority just because someone has a title." "I just didn't want to heat my crawlspace," I joked. She laughed. "Sometimes the most important stands we take are over things that seem small. Because it's not really about the crawlspace, is it? It's about respect, about reason, about treating people fairly." She was right, of course. The crawlspace had just been the battleground. The real issue had been about whether an HOA could force homeowners to do something dangerous and irrational simply because they had the power to do so. And the answer, it turned out, was no. Years have passed now, and life in the Willow Creek subdivision continues peacefully. The HOA manages genuine community concerns like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events. Regulations are reasonable and enforced fairly. When disputes arise, they're handled with communication and compromise rather than threats and fines. My crawlspace remains unheated. The water main continues to serve 7 houses without issue. The temperature down there stays consistent and cool, exactly as it should be for aging copper pipes carrying thousands of gallons of water to families who just want to live their lives. I've learned a lot from the experience. I learned the importance of documentation and expert opinions. I learned that standing up to unreasonable authority can be expensive and stressful but necessary. I learned that communities are stronger when people are willing to speak up rather than simply go along with bad decisions. Most importantly, I learned that home ownership means being responsible not just for your own property, but for how your property affects others. That water main in my crawlspace serves my neighbors. Protecting it wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about protecting everyone who depended on it. Sometimes I think about Deborah, and I wonder if she ever understood what went wrong. She had the opportunity to be a good HOA president, to genuinely serve her community and make it better. Instead, she chose control and power, and it destroyed her life. There's a lesson in that for anyone who finds themselves in a position of authority, no matter how small. As for me, I'm just a guy who owns a house in suburban Ohio. My grass gets mowed regularly. My property values are fine. My water pressure is excellent. And my crawlspace, the star of this whole saga, continues to do exactly what it's supposed to do. Exist quietly as a cool, dry space beneath my house, bothering no one and serving an important function, which is really all any of us can ask for. The neighborhood has truly become a community in the years since the incident. We look out for each other now. When old Mr. Patterson, no relation to Deborah, had a medical emergency last year, 3 neighbors were at his door within minutes because they'd noticed his routine was off. When the Thompsons lost their jobs during an economic downturn, the neighborhood quietly organized to help them with groceries and other necessities until they got back on their feet. These are the things that matter in a neighborhood. Not perfectly uniform mailboxes or crawlspace temperatures, but genuine human connection and mutual support. The last time I went down into my crawlspace was about 6 months ago to check on everything. The space was exactly as it should be. The new water main gleamed copper bright in my flashlight beam. The temperature was cool and consistent. No moisture problems, no issues at all. I thought about all the chaos that had erupted over this simple space. The demands, the fines, the legal battles, the criminal acts. All because someone with a little bit of power couldn't accept that they might be wrong, that expert opinion should matter, that some battles aren't worth fighting. As I climbed back out and locked the access door, I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd stood my ground. Grateful that the system, however slowly, had worked. Grateful that my community had learned and grown from the experience. And yes, grateful for that unremarkable crawlspace and the critical infrastructure it housed. Sometimes the most important things in our lives are the ones we never think about. The water flowing from our taps, the foundations beneath our feet, the systems that work quietly and reliably to keep our lives running smoothly. We only notice them when they break or when someone threatens to mess with them for no good reason. My crawlspace taught me that lesson, and it's one I carry with me every day. In a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming, there's something profound about understanding and protecting the simple, essential things that actually matter. The sun is setting now over Willow Creek subdivision. Kids are being called in for dinner. Dogs are barking happily in backyards. Somewhere, water is flowing through copper pipes beneath my house, serving 7 families who probably never think about where their water comes from or the small drama that once threatened to disrupt it. And that's exactly how it should be.